Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. Now on this episode, we're diving deep into the shadowy world of Russian oil shipping. And before you say that sounds about as riveting as watching paint dry, stick around, because this story actually has everything. There is intrigue, global politics, secret fleets and shady business deals. So, what is the deal with the so-called Russian shadow fleet, and how does it affect Moscow's economy? Let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
The subject of Russian oil has been making literal waves. The recent oil spill in the Black Sea, the result of a crash of 2 Russian oil tankers, has been labeled by Vladimir Putin as one of the biggest environmental challenges faced by Russia. But the woes of the Russian oil industry did not end with the oil spill cleanup. The West has begun targeting Russian oil, and in particular the so-called shadow fleet.
We will continue to take action against the Russian shadow fleet, including with sanctions that have already been introduced and others that may follow, including against specific ships and shipping companies.
The shadow fleet is a collection of some 600 vessels with dubious ownership and with ties to Russia. Moscow uses the fleet to circumvent Western sanctions on its oil export. Earlier this month, the United States hit 183 shadow fleet ships with sanctions, stranding dozens of them. The move's goal was to disrupt Moscow's energy revenue as much as possible.
There will be some significant disruption to Russian flows, at least initially. We think that could be up to 1 million barrels a day of Russian crude exports that are disrupted, at least at first.
The Eagle S is one example of what could be a Russian shadow fleet ship. It sails under the flag of the Cook Islands, and its owner company is registered in the UAE. Interestingly enough, the Eagle S is the sole ship owned by that company. The vessel is also suspected for being responsible for cutting crucial undersea cables on the Baltic seabed.
I guess the conclusion that we can draw is that get used to the new normal. These kinds of things will happen in the future as well.
Tensions surrounding Russian oil and the Russian shadow fleet are intensifying. The fleet seems to be one of Moscow's most versatile weapons, as it can be used for hybrid operations and sanctions circumvention.
And now, as always, it's time to explore the issue in greater detail. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, global sanctions started to hit the Russian economy. Think of sanctions like an embargo-based version of timeout. It's the international community collectively telling a country, you don't get to play with our toys until you stop misbehaving. Billions of dollars worth of toys, in fact, or in this case, oil revenue. Naturally, this created a teensy-weensy problem for Russia. If they are being sanctioned, how on earth can they keep selling their precious barrels of black gold? Enter the so-called shadow fleet, a bunch of ships with a collective name worthy of an off-brand spy thriller. This clandestine armada consists of older oil tankers, some of which were basically about to retire in a scrapyard, now magically repurposed to transport Russian oil under the radar. What it is a group of creaking, geriatric vessels that look like they retired from the set of a naval disaster film back in the 1970s. So how does this fleet operate, you may ask? Well, ships in this shadow fleet often rely on shell companies, and trust me when I say some of their corporate registrations are in places that are as transparent as swamp water. Then these ships go dark, so no one can trace where they are going or what they are carrying. As far as maritime etiquette goes, turning off your transponder is the equivalent of switching off your phone's GPS when you go see your mistress on the other side of town. Now, one might wonder, why does the global community care so much about these sneaky tankers? Well, it's because if you've ever tried to wash a greasy pan, you know that oil spreads everywhere. In the event of a spill, these older ships are more prone to catastrophic breakdowns. Imagine a leaky 40-year-old tanker chugging along through the Baltic Sea in the dead of night with its lights off. If it smacks into something like a reef or another ghost ship and spills thousands of barrels of oil into the ocean, or, in this case, the Baltic, you can bet that no slick-sounding corporate entity will rush forward to claim responsibility for the cleanup. Instead, the local environment and economy are left to deal with the greasy aftermath. Beyond the environmental dangers and obvious safety concerns, the existence of this shadow fleet highlights a bigger problem. Tracking and enforcing sanctions is basically tough. It's like trying to catch a ghost with a butterfly net, except these ghosts can single-handedly keep a war effort funded. Meanwhile, Moscow has every incentive to maintain these covert operations. The war in Ukraine isn't exactly cheap, and with official trade avenues drying up, they need all the revenue they can get. These Shadow Fleet tankers function as lifelines to keep Russian oil and Russian wartime coffers with it flowing. Of course, Russia isn't the only player at fault here. On the receiving end, there are countries and companies more than willing to buy cut-rate oil, no questions asked. It's similar to stumbling upon a suspiciously cheap Rolex in a back alley. If it seems too good to be true, it probably is. But for certain buyers, morality and legality can sometimes take a back seat to a sweet little discount. So, what's the solution? Increasing maritime oversight is a start. Countries should ensure more transparency and hold shipping insurers accountable for the fleets that they cover. But that requires cooperation from states and institutions that often have competing interests. As with so many global challenges, the fix is complex and requires a shared commitment. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Wojciech Jakubik, energy sector analyst at the Energy Security Center. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, as usually.
So let's talk about the Shadow Fleet conundrum. About 80% of all traffic in Russian oil now apparently goes through the Baltic Sea, at least insofar as the shadow tankers are concerned. Do we have the capacity to put this to an end?
So we have international conventions that are not allowing to easily block a trade. And what is Russia doing is an oil trade. And trading activities are not prohibited. Of course, we have oil embargo in some parts of the Western world. We have a partial embargo, and we have a maximum price cap on oil to external players like India or China. But it is not so easy to block transport through the Baltic Sea. We can inspect the ships. You've mentioned the Eagle S incident. It is a precedent that Finnish authorities found a legal ground to stop the ship, to inspect it, to ask questions to the personnel, and we have an investigation ongoing. The report from this investigation might be a basis for a new modus operandi when it comes to Russian ghost fleet, because, of course, on surface, it is a trade activity to sell the Russian oil. Even if it is partially limited by sanctions, it is a legally grounded activity. But under the surface, we see a surveillance equipment. We see a possibility that such fleet is being used for hybrid activity to attack our common critical infrastructure in energy and telecommunication sphere. So we need to act. That is why the Baltic NATO summit was so important, because we are looking for new modus operandi to answer to this threat.
But wouldn't you say that what we're doing now is answering to the security concerns, i.e. the Eagle S precedent? That ship was stopped, it was impounded and is being investigated, but that was due to the allegations that it might have severed cables lying on the Baltic seabed. Now, not all of these ships will be involved in this. Some of them, as you said, might be involved in illegal surveillance or espionage activities, but on the surface they are just sailing across international waters. So, would you say that this is a problem that we're facing when it comes to the legal framework? And if we wanted to focus on these ships solely because of them dodging sanctions, then we would have to reform certain legal regulations which apply to the Baltic Sea. And if so, which ones? Because, as you said, right now it's not so easy to stop a ship, to inspect it, even if we have reasonable suspicion that it might be uninsured or in very poor technical condition, even about to sink. We still need to take into account the legal framework in place, right?
Exactly. So that is what is happening in Poland and in different NATO countries. For example, Poland has an extensive legal grounds to even attack a ship that is creating a danger for critical infrastructure. For example, if someone is using a ship to block the shipment of LNG, to do some harm to Baltic pipe or maybe oil port, this ship, this object could be attacked on decision from Polish Minister of Defense. So we have our internal regulatory framework, but when it comes to international waters, we need to find new ways to pursue ships which are moving away from the state waters to the international waters. And that is why this precedent from Finland is so important, because Eagles was stopped in spite of the fact that it was moving into international waters. We are looking for new ways. It is a new dimension of our work, because what Russia might be doing is testing NATO, looking for weak spots, looking for procedures that are not working to further use them against us. So our answer is very, very important. In the same time, we are not Kremlin. We are going in line with international law. So we need to find some compromise between security and the regulations which are signed by our representatives.
So let's go back to the sanctions regime. Currently, we have the $60 per barrel price cap. Now, some commentators say that this, it's an ersatz, really. These are not sanctions. This is something that's supposed to make trade more difficult. But here comes the shadow fleet, or the ghost fleet, whatever you call it. They are there to try and dodge that and to allow Russia to continue racking up profits from oil. The same problem applies to LNG also. So would you say that it is a good move that the United States is now imposing sanctions on specific companies, seaports, and vessels involved in that? Because this is, frankly, something of a game changer. At least it seems so. Would you agree with that?
The scale is a game changer, because we have immediate effect on 183 ships and multiple companies, multiple subjects of international law. So the scale is really impressive, but it is only a continuation of a sanction policy. It is a process, because we have a general sanctions regime, and it is omitted by some subjects that are allowing Russia to circumvent sanctions to some extent, with losses on the way and so on. But still, Russia is able to omit the part of the sanctions. So our answer is further sanctions, the second state sanctions, which impact the subjects which are trying to omit the existing sanctions regime. And that is what is happening. We've had it in US, there was continuation in UK, and we are waiting for a decision inside the EU. In 2025, also the European Union could do something about it. And it needs to be underlined that Denmark is, for a long time, argues to do something about the ghost fleet as a threat to the environment, to international traffic in Danish Straits, because it only needs one ship that is being stuck somewhere in Danish Straits, and we have a big issue for everyone in EU and in NATO.
But also that would probably, wouldn't you say that it presents an opportunity? If these straits are so narrow, isn't it the case that these are territorial waters so that you can actually inspect these ships when passing? Because like in the middle of the Baltic Sea, okay, it's not legally possible, or at least not easy.
Yet.
But wouldn't you say that this perhaps is an option to consider? Basically, we've imposed new regulations on insurance and safety. We need to inspect every ship passing. There goes the ghost fleet. No more opportunities.
That is why those NATO patrols are so important, because you cannot be everywhere every time. So you need to have a frequent patrols, frequent inspections, higher standards for the ships that are passing through our waters. And as you said, the Danish Straits are the points in which the ghost fleet could get choked and could be stopped on legal basis. So that is the part of the solution.
Of course, Russia may want to argue that this constitutes some sort of blockade and even a declaration of war of some kind. But I mean, we're used to their language. One quick question, because we're approaching the end of our conversation. Does Russia even care? I mean, they have about, what, 600 of these ships? We've sanctioned about 200, so there is still 400 left. Also, even if we actually deal with that issue in the Baltic, would that put a serious enough dent in the Russian budget to make Russia reconsider its belligerent ambitions in Ukraine and beyond?
Of course, that Russia is taking care about what is happening because it is crying all the time about persecution from the Western states that is unlawful and so on and so on. According to the present knowledge, the newest sanction package from US blocked around 1/5 of seaborne oil exports from Russia. And it is especially important when Russia needs to diversify away from European market. Of course, it is selling some oil to Czech Republic, to Slovakia and Hungary, but those are small markets. Part of them will be lost anyway. And Russia is looking for clients in India, in China, and those clients are already refusing to cooperate with the ghost fleet that was mentioned inside of the new sanction regime from US. So those sanctions are working. It is not a job done. It needs to be continued, but it is working.
And finally, very quickly, do you consider the initial signals from the Trump administration as a good sign in this regard?
The good sign is that Donald Trump is saying that he is ready to pursue the sanction regime if Russia is not cooperating. It was not so obvious like half a year ago, so it is a good signal.
And Russia tends not to cooperate, it just tends to try and get what it wants by force, which could be its undoing, potentially.
Exactly.
Wojciech Jakubik was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight. And now we move on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Ukrainians who use their mother tongue have a positive view of their fellow countrymen who speak Russian on a day-to-day basis. The same cannot be said for their view of Ukrainians with Russian nationality, a recent survey shows.
According to research conducted by the Kiev International Institute of Sociology, 49% of Ukrainian respondents are eager to see their Russian-speaking countrymen around. 34% believe that they should continue to reside in Ukraine. Therefore, more than 4/5 of Ukrainians have a positive view of other Ukrainians who use Russian as their main language. Only 17% have a very negative outlook on the matter. When it comes to Ukrainians with Russian roots or citizenship, however, the situation looks a bit different. Only 68% of respondents said that they would welcome them in their communities, while 32% were entirely against it. By the end of 2023, over 80% of Ukrainians viewed Russians living in Russia the most negatively out of all ethnicities and nationalities. So much so that they even oppose the idea of these Russians visiting for tourist purposes.
Finnish media say that one of the country's courts has ordered the seizure of the Eagle S tanker suspected of cutting Baltic seabed cables. Finnish authorities suspect that it is part of the so-called Russian shadow fleet.
The Helsinki District Court has reportedly ordered the Eagle S to be seized indefinitely. The reason for this order is the potential liability for damages. The tanker is currently being held near the Finnish capital. The claim was filed by the Finnish and Estonian owners of the S-Link 2 cable, which was most likely damaged by the ship's anchor, as well as cut telecom cable owner Elisa. The companies are seeking damages from Eagle S's owner company, Caravella, which is based in the United Arab Emirates. Early in January, the Helsinki court had rejected the company's request to lift the seizure order. Finland's police had discovered a trail from the ship's anchor on the Baltic seabed that had dragged for dozens of kilometers. The Eagle S is believed to have cut the cables using the anchor.
Estonia has announced that it plans to guard its energy sites during the country's breakaway from the Russian grid. Energy infrastructure across the country will be secured with the help of police officers and defense volunteers.
The Baltic states intend to detach themselves from the Russian power grid in the second weekend of February. After that, they will join the more secure European energy grid. Estonia in particular is concerned about potential Russian reprisals for this decision, and wants to make sure nothing goes awry. This is why the country's interior minister announced that the police, border guard officers, and defense volunteers will work together to protect the country's critical infrastructure during the transition period. Estonia's power grid will be very vulnerable during this transition, and every precaution has to be taken, the minister has said. The plan still requires approval from both the country's government and the president, but is expected by observers to pass.
Israel is considering sending captured Russian-made equipment to aid Ukraine's defense efforts, according to Kiev's embassy in the country. The move would mean that Israel and Ukraine have entered a new stage when it comes to bilateral cooperation.
Since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Israel has limited itself to only sending humanitarian aid to Kiev. This may be changing, however. Reports from late 2024 indicate that Israel provided Ukraine with crucial resources that were needed to develop an early warning system against aerial threats. Now, a diplomatic meeting between the officials of both countries has revealed that Israeli aid may become much more substantial. The Ukrainian embassy in Israel has announced on social media that Israel is mulling sending Russian-made equipment that the IDF captured in Lebanon and in other areas to aid Ukraine's cause. The meeting between the officials also focused on the threat posed by military cooperation between Russia and Iran, which has implications for both countries.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.